Listen closely to the sound of a shutter closing, a single captured breath frozen in silver and shadow. This is the moment where appearances begin to lie, where a casual photograph conceals a current of power that runs deeper than anyone expected. You will see a smile, a hand resting on a knee, hair arranged by careful fingers, clothing arranged for the camera, yet behind that crafted calm there is a secret encoded in metal and poise. Imagine a veranda in the deep south, a girl in lace laughing at a private joke, a companion at her side whose eyes do not laugh. Read those eyes like a map and you will find the way into a hidden system of control. This is not a small historical curiosity, this is a mechanism, a social instrument forged to make cruelty appear as kindness, a psychology of domination dressed in velvet and ribbons. I am not asking you to look kindly at the past, I am asking you to see clearly, to watch how an entire class of men and women learn to hide power inside beauty, to convert a chain into a charm and call it compassion. There are layers here, on the surface a tableau designed to reassure neighbors and posterity, underneath a design meant to manage the emotions of two young people while the adult world profits from the deception. The camera itself becomes a collaborator, its gaze set to compose an acceptable story, yet through patient examination the photograph can be made to confess, a small metallic glint, an outline beneath fabric, a manufactured lie revealed. You may feel anger, yes, but also a deeper shudder of recognition, because this is not only about distant cruelty, it is about how systems of power manufacture narratives that make exploitation look harmless and even tender. Tonight we begin to strip away that fabrication, we will pull threads from the stitched narrative until the truth hangs like a raw nerve, and you will not return unchanged. Listen as if this is a warning given in an empty house, because what you will learn is not safe, it is destabilizing by design, and those who profit from illusion will resist with everything they have. Keep your eyes unflinching, your judgment steady, and prepare to go where most historians feared to look, because the image that once soothed will become the instrument that awakens you to the structures that still shape lives today. The photograph arrived in a plain envelope, an heirloom passed down and catalogued with a polite label that softened its reality, a child named companion, a family portrait completed, the language of donation consenting to amnesia. Curators read these notations and accept a story that comforts donors, yet the archive keeps secrets as well as objects. Every accession note a potential veil, and some veils hide rituals of control. The girl on the left presents as center stage royalty, her posture a practiced lesson in superiority. The girl beside her sits closer than social custom should allow, their proximity signals a performance arranged by adults who understand optics. When the curator enlarged the image and shifted the contrast, the metal emerged, a circlet that loops around an ankle like adornment, carefully designed to look like jewelry, precise enough to catch light and yet cruel enough to pin a person to place. This practice had a name beneath the euphemisms: companionate possession, the purchase of a human being whose social function was to embody the owner's benevolence while being physically constrained at all times. Think about the audacity of it, to manufacture an emotional bond through ownership, to demand affection from the one who is owned, to train a child to be both friend and prisoner. This is a psychological architecture of domination. Owners called it refinement, they boasted of their tastes while commissioning artisans to make restraints that would please the eye and prevent escape. Jewelers and silversmiths became craftsmen of control, signing pieces with style and intent. These images were then placed in albums in parlors to prove civilization and care, to signal that the household practiced enlightened bondage, and the public accepted the illusion because it fit a comfortable narrative of noblesse oblige. But the underside of that narrative is simple and brutal: a child taught to perform affection while knowing her wrist or ankle is locked, a young life disciplined into behaving as an exhibit that soothes the conscience of its owners. We must learn to read these manufactured smiles as evidence rather than sentiment, to decode the symbols placed there to hide violence, because once the pattern is visible the entire archive changes its meaning. The act of recognition is not merely academic, it is a form of reclamation for those whose lives were misread. It strips away the flattering lie and restores personhood to the one who was used as a display of gentility. History loves neat categories, victims and villains, but the reality is messy, complicated by intimacy and by the way domination co-opts affection into its own machinery. When a family acquires an enslaved companion for a daughter, they are not only buying labor, they are buying emotional labor, an obligation for warmth, attention, and the performance of mutuality. This was gendered exploitation, a form of control that targeted the emotional development of a white girl and the bodily autonomy of a black child at once, a dual wound inflicted in plain sight. Read the diaries of plantation mistresses and you will find the clinical tone of a consumer choosing the right temperament, language that frames human beings as curated companions to fill a social niche. They note good manners, a pleasing face, a voice that can be coached, and a body that can be bound in prettified restraints. Then they celebrate the arrangement in parlors where the photograph will later be taken. For the companion, the experience is contradictory, taught to read and write enough to perform refinement, then punished for any sign of independence, taught to be intimate but forbidden real bonds with peers. Imagine the psychological strain of smiling on command while your ankle presses against metal. Imagine the cognitive dissonance when affection is demanded by law rather than chosen by heart. Collectors and collectors' families preserved these images to prove status, and museums accepted them as heirlooms of social history, until a new method of seeing revealed what had been hiding in the margins. Digital enhancement, spectral analysis, patient forensics unspooled the details that earlier eyes missed, the glint of a clasp, the outline of a keyhole, the faint impression of a maker's hallmark. Once revealed, the restraint ceases to be a private oddity and becomes a public indictment, a manufactured feature built into social life to sustain inequality and to naturalize domination. This is structural cruelty, not an accident, and it mattered to markets and to minds because it preserved a social order that required both spectacle and secrecy. Every photograph that once soothed a conscience now becomes proof of a practice, and once the evidence accumulates, the narrative of kindness collapses into a ledger of exploitation. We are obligated to follow that ledger to the people who suffered and to those who survived and told their stories in small voices decades later when someone finally chose to listen. You are halfway into this descent now, and what I will ask next is simple and direct and strategic. If the image unsettles you, write the phrase "I see the chain" twice in the comments right now to lock in your attention and to help others find this truth too. Do it exactly like this: I see the chain, I see the chain, and watch how engagement amplifies the reach of what we reveal together. This is not a trivial gimmick, it is an act of alignment, a public mark that says you will not let history be smoothed over, a small ritual that organizes attention and starts conversations that institutions would rather avoid. Now return with me to evidence and testimony, where the human detail overturns the official story. Descendants and oral histories build a different archive, a living memory that corrects the polished narrative of family albums. There are recorded interviews from the federal writers and other projects where grown women recall gold filigree installed around their wrists, where the decorative cuff becomes a talisman of shame and survival at once. Listen to those testimonies and you will hear a pattern: survivors who learned to reframe their lives for safety, who described the chain as a token yet remembered the weight in cold nights and the fear of being separated from siblings. The practice was widespread across elite plantations in several states, and it persisted because it answered a social need for display and control. It kept girls available as emotional resources and not as citizens. Find the ledgers that list purchases described as companions. Those are not private purchases, they are market signals designed to standardize a cruel practice, and some jewelers sent invoices itemizing decorative locks and secure fittings. This economic trail is a smoking gun, an intersection of commerce and domination, where profit meets a desire to naturalize ownership through aesthetics. Then follow the documents to the legal records where wills and inventories list companion restraints among family valuables, an appalling catalog that treats human bonds as property to be bequeathed. The moral weight of these documents changes you, because they show intention in design, not accidental cruelty, a system that invested skill and status into making chains pretty so they would be acceptable to polite society. Now imagine the survivors bringing those objects north to safe houses, hiding the cuff as a secret talisman, a relic of bondage turned into evidence, and later a story passed to grandchildren to keep memory alive. Resistance lives in the margins of these images, in the small acts of defiance that hospitality and power overlooked, the subtle erasures that did not succeed. Where there is imposed intimacy, there is also a possibility of subversion. Companions learned codes, they learned where to whisper, how to pass a folded note, how to memorize a route to freedom. Some used the very proximity imposed on them to gather intelligence, to map the comings and goings of carriages and to learn the names of guards and the cadence of patrols. Intimacy turned into reconnaissance. The photograph we began with may have been staged to reassure, yet that same stage could hide a folded paper, a map, a token that later saved lives when passed along to an underground network. Survivor testimonies describe elements of this: a companion who knew the household routines pointed out moments of weakness, a child who could slip into a kitchen and learn the guard's shift. Many of the greatest escapes were organized by people who had inside knowledge, and those who were forced into performative friendship often had more access than field hands. When the curtain of war tore social order, the companions sometimes seized openings to flee, to join networks northward, carrying with them small objects that proved both their captivity and their courage. Museums and archives sometimes hold those objects: a cuff, a ribbon with a lock, a handwritten list passed under tablecloths, and when scholars look, these relics become testimony. The work of recovery is painstaking. It requires cross-referencing plantation letters, auction records, oral histories, and legal filings to trace a single life across states and decades. When enough threads converge, a story emerges not of passive suffering but of strategic survival, people who turned imposed roles into opportunities for escape and rescue. That is the darker, truer history, where power is contested in subtle ways, where the forced performance of affection becomes a cover for organizing, where chains are turned into evidence that leads to freedom. Institutions then and institutions now will try to manage what we know. They will sanitize, suppress, and sometimes litigate to keep reputations intact. When researchers expose these companion practices, families and donors may bristle, museum boards weigh benefactors against truth, and the political economy of memory resists change. This is why public disclosure matters, because truth that stays in academic journals does not reach grandchildren, does not return a name to a family, does not force a society to re-examine its comfortable myths. Exhibition is not spectacle when it restores agency, when it pairs the image with testimony, when it displays a cuff with a personal story. That is a moral recalibration of what counts as history. We must insist that archives be interrogated with tools that reveal hidden marks, with imaging and with oral history protocols that center survivors and their descendants. The corrective is not merely retrospective apology, it is structural change in how institutions acquire, label, and present materials that were once treated as benign trophies. It is a commitment to resist donor pressure when truth requires discomfort, to fund forensic analysis that surfaces patterns, and to listen to the descendants who bring context and claim. Power defends itself, yet power also cracks, and public pressure organized by engaged citizens rewrites the rules of what museums will tolerate as acceptable narrative. This is not gentle work. It requires organizers who will lean into controversy, scholars who will publish without flinching, and audiences willing to look and to stay with discomfort until it becomes clarity. The chains in the photographs will not disappear, but the context around them can be transformed so they are seen as instruments of domination rather than decorative curiosities. Truth is abrasive, it reshapes institutions through public reckoning, and that reshaping is the only path to a historical record that honors those who were forced to smile for cameras while shackled. Now take a final look at that photograph, not as a singular curiosity but as a node in a network of practices that produced and sustained inequality. See the companion not as a prop but as a person who navigated and engineered intimacy to survive, who may have used that imposed proximity to resist in ways the household never imagined. Remember the testimonies that surfaced later, the cuff preserved in a descendant's attic, the diary entry that confesses discomfort, the ledger that lists purchases meant to charm and to chain. History is populated with people who turned imposed roles inside out, who hid maps and seams and messages and embroidered cuffs, and for every photograph that hides a shackle there is a life that carried its memory forward. Our responsibility now is to preserve that memory with rigor, to name the practice, to catalog the evidence, and to center the voices of those who survived and those who descend from them. You have watched a veil removed, you have seen how beautiful things can mask cruelty, and that knowledge is dangerous in the sense that it breaks complacency and compels action. If you value truth, share this video with someone who still believes history is simple. Comment again, I see the chain, to reaffirm your commitment to revelation and to amplify this work. History will not correct itself unless engaged citizens, scholars, and institutions insist upon the hard work of disclosing and reinterpreting evidence. Carry this image with you as a calibration tool, a way to test stories presented as comfortable by default and to question the ornaments that might hide oppression. We have only just begun to look into the margins where power and beauty intersect. Keep watching, keep questioning, and do not let a pretty picture distract you from the weight it may conceal.